The marble steps of the Jefferson County Courthouse sparkled in the morning sun as Assistant U.S. Attorney Malcolm Pierce strode up the walkway, his briefcase in one hand and a coffee in the other. He was a man accustomed to the rhythms of justice, the measured cadence of legal arguments, and the subtle dance of courtroom politics. His salt and pepper hair and tailored navy suit gave him an air of quiet authority, but it was his eyes, sharp, observant, and unflinching, that truly set him apart. Malcolm had tried cartel bosses, white-collar criminals, and corrupt officials, but his title never clouded his sense of fairness. He believed in the law, but more than that, he believed in justice. That morning, he was scheduled to argue a motion in a high-profile fraud case, and as he entered the courthouse lobby, he nodded to the security guards, who greeted him by name. He was reviewing his notes when a commotion erupted near the metal detectors. A white police officer, tall and broad-shouldered with a buzz cut and a jaw set in a permanent scowl, was arguing with a black man in a charcoal suit. The officer barked, "I told you, you need to come with me," before grabbing the man by the arm. "You fit the description. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Malcolm paused, his instincts kicking in. He recognized the officer, Sergeant Rick Donnelly, notorious for his aggressive tactics and reputation for mistaken identity, stops that always seemed to target the same kind of people. The man Donnelly was accosting looked familiar, and as Malcolm stepped closer, he realized with a jolt that the man was himself, or rather, someone who looked enough like him to be his brother. The man was protesting, his voice calm but firm. "Officer, I'm here for a court appearance. I have my ID right here." But Donnelly wasn't listening. He twisted the man's arm behind his back, snapping on handcuffs as the crowd watched in stunned silence. "You're under arrest for failure to comply," Donnelly announced, ignoring the man's protests. Malcolm's blood boiled. He stepped forward, flashing his badge. "Sergeant Donnelly, what's going on here?" Donnelly turned, his eyes narrowing. "Stay out of this, sir. Police business." "That's my colleague," Malcolm said, improvising. "He's a federal prosecutor. You're making a mistake." Donnelly scoffed. "Yes, and I am also the mayor. He fits the description of a suspect in a robbery last night. I'm taking him in." The man in cuffs looked at Malcolm, a silent plea in his eyes. Malcolm gave a nod and reached for his phone. "I'm calling the U.S. Attorney's office. You're detaining a federal officer without cause." Donnelly hesitated, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He can explain himself at the station. Malcolm followed as Donnelly marched the man outside, ignoring the murmurs of the onlookers. At the curb, Donnelly shoved the man into the back of his cruiser and turned to Malcolm. "You want to come too, counselor? Be my guest." Malcolm slid into the passenger seat, his mind racing. He knew he had to keep his cool, but every fiber of his being screamed at the injustice unfolding before him. The ride to the precinct was tense, Donnelly's knuckles white on the steering wheel. At the station, Donnelly processed a man, whose name, it turned out, was Leonard Harris, a public defender with the same build and complexion as Malcolm. Leonard tried to explain, but Donnelly cut him off at every turn, refusing to check credentials or listen to reason. Malcolm watched in disbelief as Leonard was fingerprinted, photographed, and placed in a holding cell. "This is outrageous," Malcolm said, confronting Donnelly in the hallway. "You're violating his rights." Donnelly sneered. "You lawyers always think you're above the law. Maybe if you people learned to follow instructions, you wouldn't have these problems." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "I'm filing a complaint. And when this is over, you'll be lucky to have a job." Donnelly laughed, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Do what you want. I have witnesses." He resisted arrest. Malcolm stormed out, dialing the U.S. Office of the Attorney within minutes. The chief of the criminal division was on the line, and soon after, the precinct captain was summoned. The captain, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for fairness, listened as Malcolm explained what had happened. She ordered Leonard released immediately and demanded to see Donnelly's report. As Leonard was freed, he shook Malcolm's hand. "Thank you. I've dealt with guys like him before, but it never gets easier." Malcolm nodded. "We're not done yet." Malcolm followed when the captain summoned Donnelly to her office. determined to bring about justice. As the door closed behind them, Malcolm realized that this was more than just a case of mistaken identity. It was a test of the system, of his own resolve, and of the power of one man to make a difference. And he was ready to fight. The captain's office was silent except for the ticking of a wall clock and the low hum of the air conditioner, but the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sergeant Donnelly stood at attention, his jaw clenched, while Malcolm and Captain Ramirez sat across from him, the captain's steely gaze fixed on the officer. "Sergeant, I've reviewed the intake paperwork and the body cam footage," Ramirez began, her voice even but cold. "You failed to check Mr. Harris's identification, ignored his repeated attempts to explain, and escalated the situation without cause. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Donnelly's face became redder, but he continued. "He fit the description, Captain. Gray suit, medium build, black man. He was acting suspicious. Suspicious how?" Malcolm interjected, unable to keep the edge from his voice. "By walking into a courthouse in a suit and carrying a briefcase?" Donnelly glared at him. He got mouthy. "Didn't follow my instructions." By raising a hand, Ramirez silenced them both. "Sergeant, you're on thin ice. I'm placing you on administrative leave, pending a full investigation. Turn in your badge and weapon." Donnelly's eyes widened in disbelief, but he complied, slamming his badge on the desk before storming out. Malcolm let out a slow breath. The adrenaline finally ebbed. "Thank you, Captain. I'll be filing a formal complaint with Internal Affairs and the DOJ's Civil Rights Division." Ramirez nodded. "I expect nothing less. This department has no room for that kind of behavior." Malcolm found Leonard Harris waiting in the hallway as he left the office. He had regained his composure, but his eyes were still haunted. "You didn't have to do all that," Leonard said quietly. "But I'm glad you did." Malcolm shook his hand. "We have to look out for each other. This isn't the first time, and it won't be the last. But it's not going to happen again, not if I can help it." The two men agreed to keep in touch and support one another in the upcoming battles after exchanging contact information. Malcolm returned to the courthouse, his mind racing with thoughts of justice, accountability, and the insidious ways bias could infect even the most sacred institutions. He was late for his hearing, but the judge, an old friend, gave him a knowing nod as he entered the courtroom. "Everything all right, Mr. Pierce?" The judge asked, his tone gentle. Malcolm straightened his tie. "Just a minor delay, Your Honor." Ready to proceed. As the hearing unfolded, Malcolm found himself distracted, replaying the morning's events in his mind. He thought of all the times he'd been stopped, questioned, or followed for no reason other than the color of his skin. He thought of the young men he'd mentored, the warnings he'd given them about how to survive encounters with law enforcement. And he thought of Donnelly, so certain of his own righteousness, so blind to the harm he caused. After court, Malcolm called his wife Vanessa and told her what had happened. She listened quietly, her voice trembling with anger and fear. "I'm glad you're okay," she said. "But what if someone else had done it? Someone without your badge, your connections?" Malcolm's heart ached. "That's why I have to take action. Not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been in that position." That evening, Malcolm sat at his kitchen table, drafting a detailed complaint. He included every fact, every witness, every piece of evidence he could gather. He sent copies to Internal Affairs, the DOJ, and the local press. He called Leonard, who agreed to go public with his story, and together they began reaching out to community organizations, civil rights groups, and anyone who would listen. The story spread quickly, picked up by local news and then national outlets. Federal prosecutor intervenes in wrongful arrest by local cop. The headlines blared. The police department scrambled to respond, issuing statements about ongoing investigations and commitment to fairness. But the damage was done. Donnelly's record came under scrutiny, and it wasn't long before other victims came forward. Black men, Latino men, even a few white men who'd been caught up in his dragnet. Each story was a variation on the same theme. A cop who saw what he wanted to see, who acted first and asked questions later. Malcolm found himself at the center of a growing movement, invited to speak at town halls, legal forums, and rallies. He used his platform to call for reforms, mandatory body cameras, implicit bias training, independent oversight of police misconduct. He met with city officials, police brass, and lawmakers pushing for real change. Some resisted, accusing him of playing a race card or undermining law enforcement, but Malcolm refused to back down. He knew the stakes were too high. One night, after a particularly heated city council meeting, Malcolm sat alone in his office, staring at the city lights. He thought of his father, a civil rights attorney who'd marched in Selma and argued cases before the Supreme Court. He thought of his son, just starting high school, and the world he wanted to leave behind. He knew the fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, he felt hope, a sense that, together, they could bend the arc of history just a little closer to justice. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind for Malcolm Pierce, as the story of Sergeant Donnelly's wrongful arrest and the revelation of Leonard Harris's true identity as a public defender continued to dominate headlines and spark heated debate across the city. Malcolm found himself fielding calls from journalists, activists, and even old law school classmates who wanted to lend their support or simply hear the story firsthand. He and Leonard became unlikely partners in advocacy, appearing together at community forums and on local radio shows, their message clear and unwavering: accountability, transparency, and respect for the rights of every citizen, regardless of race or status. The city's Black Bar Association invited Malcolm to deliver the keynote at their annual banquet, and as he stood before a packed ballroom, he spoke not just of his own experience, but of countless others who had suffered in silence. "We are not here to tear down the law," he said, his voice steady, "but to demand that it serve all of us equally. Justice is not a privilege. It is a promise." The applause was thunderous, and afterward, young attorneys and law students crowded around him, eager for advice and inspiration. Meanwhile, the investigation into Donnelly's conduct deepened. Internal Affairs uncovered a pattern of complaints stretching back years, allegations of racial profiling, excessive force, and falsified reports. The department, under mounting public pressure, convened a special review board that included community leaders, civil rights attorneys, and even a retired judge. Malcolm was asked to serve as an advisor, and he accepted, determined to see the process through. The review board's hearings were tense and emotional, with victims of Donnelly's actions testifying about their experiences. Some wept as they recounted being handcuffed in front of their children or humiliated in public for crimes they didn't commit. Donnelly himself was called to testify, and though he tried to justify his actions as good police work, the evidence was overwhelming. The board recommended his termination and referred several cases to the district attorney for possible criminal charges. The city council, emboldened by the public outcry, passed a series of reforms: a new civilian oversight commission, expanded body camera requirements, and mandatory de-escalation and anti-bias training for all officers. Malcolm and Leonard were invited to the signing ceremony, and as the mayor handed them commemorative pens, Malcolm felt a surge of pride, not for himself, but for the community that had refused to be silent. Yet, not everyone was pleased. Malcolm received hate mail and anonymous threats, some warning him to watch his back or stay in his lane. One night, as he left his office, he noticed a police cruiser idling across the street, its headlights off. He called Vanessa, who urged him to be careful, and for the first time, Malcolm felt a flicker of fear. But he refused to be intimidated. He increased his security, alerted the authorities, and pressed on with his work. The support from the community far outweighed the hate, and Malcolm drew strength from the people who stopped him on the street to say thank you, from the parents who told him their children now saw a prosecutor who looked like them standing up for what was right. At home, his son, Marcus Jr., watched the news with wide eyes, asking questions about justice and fairness. Malcolm answered honestly, using the moment to teach his son about courage, integrity, and the importance of standing up for others. The case became a catalyst for broader conversations about race, policing, and the meaning of justice in America. Schools invited Malcolm to speak to students. Churches held prayer vigils, and local businesses sponsored Know Your Rights workshops. The city, once divided by suspicion and fear, began to heal, its residents united by a shared commitment to change. Through it all, Malcolm remained humble, reminding everyone that the fight was not about one man or one incident, but about building a system that lived up to its ideals. The city organized a Day of Justice to commemorate the anniversary of the incident, inviting Malcolm, Leonard, and other advocates to lead a march from the courthouse to City Hall. Thousands turned out, their voices rising a chorus of hope and determination. Malcolm walked at the front, his family by his side, his heart full. He knew there would be setbacks, that progress was never linear, but as he looked at the faces around him, young and old, black and white, united in purpose, he believed more than ever that justice was within reach. The Day of Justice March marked a turning point not only for Malcolm Pierce, but for the entire city, as the energy and unity of that day reverberated through neighborhoods, City Hall, and even the police department itself. In the weeks that followed, Malcolm found himself busier than ever, not just as a federal prosecutor, but as a mentor, advisor, and sometimes even a counselor to those who reached out for guidance. He worked with the new Civilian Oversight Commission, helping to draft policies that would ensure transparency and accountability for years to come. He and Leonard Harris, now close friends, launched a legal clinic for victims of wrongful arrest and police misconduct, offering pro bono representation and education on civil rights. Volunteers from law schools, retired judges, and even a few police officers who wanted to be a part of the solution came to the clinic, which quickly became a community beacon. Malcolm's days were long, but he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond any courtroom victory. He saw the impact of his work in the faces of the people he helped. Families reunited, young men given a second chance, and children who no longer feared the sight of a police car. The police department, under new leadership, began to change as well. Officers were required to participate in community service, attend regular anti-bias workshops, and meet quarterly with the Oversight Commission. The department's new chief, a black woman with a reputation for fairness and integrity, invited Malcolm to speak at the police academy, where he shared his story and challenged cadets to see every person they encountered as a human being first. Some officers resisted, clinging to old prejudices, but many embraced a change, grateful for the chance to rebuild trust with the community. Malcolm's own life changed, too. He was promoted to deputy chief of the criminal division, his reputation as a principled and fearless advocate cemented. Vanessa, his wife, became a leader in the PDA and a sought-after speaker on issues of equity in education. Their son, Marcus Jr., started a social justice club at his high school, inspired by his father's example. The family grew closer, united by a shared sense of mission and hope. Yet, Malcolm never forgot the cost of change. He still received the occasional threat, still saw the wary glances from those who resented his work. But he also saw the progress, the drop in wrongful arrests, the rise in community police partnerships, the new generation of lawyers and activists who looked to him for guidance. One evening, as he walked home from the legal clinic, Malcolm paused at the courthouse steps, the same steps where the ordeal had begun. He remembered the fear and anger he'd felt that day, the humiliation of seeing a fellow black professional treated as a suspect simply because of his skin. He remembered the resolve that had carried him through, the allies who had stood by his side, and the victories, large and small, that had followed. As the sun set behind the courthouse, Malcolm felt a deep sense of peace. He knew the work was far from over, that injustice would always find new ways to hide, but he also knew that he was not alone. The city had changed, and so had he. He had learned that justice was not a destination but a journey, one that required courage, persistence, and above all, hope. He had learned that a single voice, raised in truth, could inspire a chorus. And he had learned that sometimes the greatest victories came not from the courtroom, but from the hearts and minds of the people he served. Malcolm smiled and took light steps as he turned to go home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, and new opportunities to fight for what was right. But tonight, he allowed himself to rest, knowing that he had made a difference, not just for himself, but for everyone who believed that justice, in the end, must belong to us all.